The year is 1143, or perhaps 877, maybe even 1492. Across the medieval world, minds grappled with questions that twisted reason and logic into knots. These were not simple puzzles. They were deep, unsettling inquiries that challenged everything people thought they knew about God, the universe, and themselves. For centuries, brilliant thinkers debated these mysteries, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions that still echo through time. Number 1. The problem of universals. For centuries, medieval scholars wrestled with one of the most fundamental questions about reality: what is real? This was not about the existence of a table or a chair. It was about something far more abstract. The question revolved around universals. Things like humanity, redness, justice, or beauty. Do these concepts exist independently of individual things, or are they merely names we give to collections of similar items? This might sound like a word game, but for medieval philosophers it touched the very core of knowledge, theology, and how the world worked. Think about humanity. You see individual humans, a baker in Paris, a farmer in England, a scholar in Baghdad. Each is a distinct person. But what makes them all human? Is there a real existing humanity out there somewhere that all these individuals share, like a blueprint? Or is humanity just a label we stick on them because they have similar characteristics? This was the problem of universals, and it divided the intellectual landscape into warring camps. On one side were the Realists. They argued that universals were indeed real, existing independently of individual things. For a strong realist, redness was not just a word for all red things. There was a true, singular redness that existed, and individual red objects somehow participated in or derived their redness from this universal form. This idea had deep roots in ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the teachings of Plato. Plato believed in a world of perfect forms, where the ideal chair existed independently of any physical chair we could ever sit on. Physical chairs were just imperfect copies. Medieval realists, like Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, adapted these ideas to a Christian framework. For Anselm, these universals could even exist in the mind of God as divine ideas that shaped creation. To deny the reality of universals for a realist was to potentially undermine the very order of creation and even the nature of God's thought. Then there were the Nominalists. Their name comes from the Latin word nomen, meaning name. They argued that universals were not real things existing out there. Instead, they were merely names or concepts that we as humans apply to collections of similar individual things. For a nominalist, humanity does not exist independently. Only individual humans exist. We group them together under the label humanity for convenience, to help us think and communicate. Rostalin of Compiègne, a French philosopher from the 11th century, is often cited as an early and controversial nominalist. He argued that only individual substances are real. If you say humanity or redness, you are just using a sound, a word, that refers to many individuals but has no separate existence of its own. This had radical implications. If only individuals were real, what did that mean for the concept of the Trinity, where God is one but also three persons? Some realists accused nominalists of heresy for potentially fragmenting the divine essence. Between these two extreme positions, many tried to find a middle ground. Peter Abelard, a 12th century philosopher, developed a position often called conceptualism. He argued that universals do not exist as independent entities in the world, nor are they mere words. Instead, they exist as concepts in the human mind. When we see many individual red things, our mind forms a concept of redness based on those observations. This concept is real, but its reality is in our understanding, not as an external independent entity. Abelard's ideas were complex, and often led to accusations of both nominalism and realism, depending on who was interpreting him. His work, like Logica Ingredientibus, explored how language and thought interact with reality. The debate was not just academic. It had profound implications for theology, logic, and even law. If universals were real, then abstract concepts like justice or sin had a definite, unchanging reality that could be understood and applied universally. If they were just names, then how could we speak of universal moral laws or the shared nature of humanity that connected all people to original sin and redemption? The status of the Church itself as a universal body was sometimes linked to this debate. If there was no real Church as a universal entity, only individual believers, what did that mean for its authority? Scholars pored over ancient texts, particularly the works of Aristotle, which had been rediscovered and translated into Latin. Aristotle, unlike Plato, believed that forms, universals, existed within individual things, not separate from them. For example, the humanity of a person existed as an essential part of that person, not as a separate entity in some other realm. This view, known as moderate realism, was championed by figures like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas, in his monumental work Summa Theologica, carefully navigated the problem. He argued that universals exist in three ways: ante rem, before the thing, in the mind of God as divine ideas; in re, in the thing, as essential forms within individual objects; and post rem, after the thing, as concepts formed by the human intellect based on observing individual objects. This sophisticated approach tried to reconcile the insights of both Plato and Aristotle, providing a comprehensive framework for understanding universals. However, even Aquinas' brilliant synthesis did not end the debate. Duns Scotus, a Franciscan philosopher from the late 13th century, offered his own nuanced view. Scotus, sometimes called the subtle doctor, introduced the idea of haechiety, from the Latin haec, meaning thisness. He argued that what makes an individual unique is not just its participation in universals, but an additional singular thisness that makes it distinct. This focus on individuality, while still acknowledging universals, pushed the boundaries of the debate. The problem of universals remained a hot topic throughout the medieval period and beyond. It fueled arguments in universities, shaped the way logic was taught, and influenced theological doctrines. Was Katniss real? Was goodness an independent entity? Was triangularity something more than just a description of shapes? The medieval philosophers never reached a universal consensus. They left us with different ways of looking at reality, each with its own logical elegance and its own unsettling implications, without ever truly settling whether the humanity we all share is a concept, a name, or a truly existing thing. Number 2. The efficacy of sacraments. Throughout the medieval period, the Church was central to daily life. Sacraments, like baptism, communion, the Eucharist, confession, and marriage, were not just rituals. They were believed to be powerful channels of God's grace, essential for salvation. But how exactly did they work? What made them effective? This was the efficacy of sacraments question, and it caused serious theological headaches and even bitter disputes for centuries. The core of the problem could be put simply: did the sacrament's effectiveness depend on the holiness or moral state of the person performing it, the priest or bishop, or did it work independently, solely through God's grace and the correct performance of the rite? This question was not abstract. It had enormous practical consequences for ordinary believers. If a priest was secretly living in sin, or if he had been ordained by a bishop who himself was tainted, did that mean all the baptisms, masses, and confessions performed by that priest were invalid? Were the souls of the faithful put at risk? The earliest and most famous dispute around this question involved the Donatists in the 4th and 5th centuries, though their ideas continued to echo through the medieval period. The Donatists, a Christian sect in North Africa, believed that the validity of a sacrament depended on the worthiness of the minister. They argued that any priest or bishop who had lapsed during Roman persecutions, meaning they had betrayed their faith under duress, could no longer validly administer sacraments. If such a priest performed a baptism, for example, the Donatists believed it was not a true baptism and had to be redone by a pure minister. They insisted on the absolute moral purity of the clergy for sacraments to be effective. St. Augustine of Hippo, a towering intellectual figure of the 5th century, vehemently opposed the Donatist view. His arguments became foundational for later medieval theology. Augustine, in works such as On Baptism, against the Donatists, argued that the sacraments derive their efficacy from God's power, not from the human minister. He famously used the Latin phrase ex opere operato, which means from the work worked, or by the very act of being performed. According to this view, the sacrament's effectiveness comes from Christ himself, who is the true minister of all sacraments. The human priest is merely an instrument. As long as the priest performs the rite correctly, using the right words and actions, and intends to do what the Church does, the sacrament is valid, regardless of the priest's personal holiness or sinfulness. Augustine reasoned that if the validity depended on the priest's hidden moral state, no one could ever be truly certain if they had received grace, leading to perpetual anxiety and undermining the very purpose of the sacraments. God's grace, Augustine argued, is not tied to human imperfection. Despite Augustine's powerful arguments, the shadow of Donatism periodically reappeared throughout the Middle Ages, especially during times of clerical corruption or challenges to papal authority. For example, during the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, when the papacy sought to assert its authority and purify the clergy, questions about simony, the buying or selling of church offices, and clerical marriage led to renewed debates about the validity of sacraments performed by priests who were considered unworthy. If a priest had bought his office, was his ordination valid? Could he validly perform Mass? The scholastic philosophers of the High Middle Ages, like Peter Lombard in his Sentences, a widely used theological textbook from the 12th century, carefully elaborated on Augustine's principles. Lombard's work became a standard text that generations of scholars studied and commented upon, further solidifying the ex opere operato doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, provided the most comprehensive and systematic articulation of this view in his Summa Theologica. Aquinas stressed that Christ is the principal agent of the sacraments, and the priest acts in Christ's person, in persona Christi. He distinguished between the validity of a sacrament, whether it truly takes place, and its fruitfulness, how much grace a person receives. While the sacrament is valid regardless of the minister's personal sin, a person receiving the sacrament might receive less grace if they approach it with a lack of faith or unrepentant sin, but this does not invalidate the sacrament itself. However, even with these sophisticated explanations, the question did not entirely vanish from the minds of the faithful or from the debates of theologians. Personal piety and moral standing of priests remained a concern. If a priest was known to be a sinner, even if his sacraments were technically valid, would people be less likely to trust him or to believe that God's grace truly flowed through his hands? The human element, the visible conduit of divine power, was hard to separate entirely from the divine act itself. The question also touched upon the nature of God's grace. Was it irresistible, flowing freely through the established channels, or did it require some level of human cooperation or purity from the minister? The medieval church firmly maintained that God's grace was sovereign and worked through the sacraments regardless of the minister's state. But this was a theological position that sometimes stood in tension with the lived experience of moral expectations. The belief in the ex opere operato doctrine was a source of comfort and certainty for many, ensuring that salvation was not dependent on the hidden sins of a human intermediary. Yet, it also presented a profound paradox. How could a sacred, perfect, divine act be mediated through imperfect, fallen human beings without some of that human imperfection tainting the divine? This baffling question remained central to the medieval understanding of faith and practice, forever reminding them that God's ways were often beyond full human comprehension. Number 3. The problem of evil. If God is all good, all-powerful, and all-knowing, why does evil exist in the world? This is a question that has haunted thinkers for millennia, and the medieval period was no exception. For philosophers and theologians deeply committed to a Christian worldview, where God is perfectly benevolent and omnipotent, the presence of suffering, injustice, and moral wrongdoing posed a profound and often distressing intellectual challenge. This was known as the problem of evil, and it demanded an answer. The problem can be broken down into a few key points. If God is all good, he would want to eliminate evil. If God is all powerful, he would be able to eliminate evil. Yet evil clearly exists. This apparent contradiction led to intense philosophical struggle. How could a perfectly good God allow horrendous suffering, natural disasters, and the moral depravity of humanity? One of the earliest and most influential responses came from St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. Augustine himself had wrestled with this question deeply, having for a time been a follower of Manichaeism, a religion that believed in two eternal opposing forces, one good and one evil. He later rejected this view. In his major work, Confessions, Augustine explained his breakthrough. Evil is not a substance or a created thing. Instead, evil is a privation or absence of good, just as darkness is the absence of light, or cold is the absence of heat. Evil is the absence or corruption of the good that God created. God created everything good. Sin and suffering arise when created beings, particularly humans, turn away from the good, or when good things are used or experienced in a disordered way. A disease, for example, is a privation of health, a corruption of the body's natural goodness. Moral evil or sin is a turning away from God's will, a deliberate choice to prefer a lesser good over a greater one. Augustine's privation theory was widely adopted in the medieval period, but it did not fully resolve the issue for many. It explained what evil is, an absence, but it did not fully explain why an all-good God would permit the possibility of such a privation, especially when it led to so much suffering. Another key part of the medieval response focused on human free will. Philosophers like Boethius, writing in the 6th century while imprisoned and facing execution, pondered this in his influential work, The Consolation of Philosophy. He and later medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century argued that moral evil stems from human free will. God, in his infinite goodness, chose to create creatures with free will, even knowing they might choose to do evil. Why? Because the good of having free, rational creatures who can freely choose to love and obey God is greater than the good of having a world populated by automatons who are forced to do good. Possibility of sin is a necessary consequence of free will, and therefore, God is not directly the cause of sin. Humans, by their own choices, bring moral evil into the world. This argument satisfied some, but others found it insufficient. If God is all-knowing, did he not know beforehand that humanity would choose to sin? And if so, why create them with such a dangerous freedom? This led to intricate discussions about divine foreknowledge and human responsibility, which were themselves baffling questions. Another angle explored was the idea that evil serves a greater purpose within God's plan. This was often called the greater good defense. For instance, some suffering might be necessary for humans to develop virtues like patience, compassion, or courage. A world without any challenges might be a world without opportunity for growth, or the suffering of the innocent might be mysterious, but it could be part of a larger, inscrutable divine plan that will ultimately lead to a greater good, perhaps in the afterlife. Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century argued that God permits evil only because he is so powerful that he can bring good out of it. This idea suggested that what appears as evil to humans might, from a divine perspective, contribute to a harmonious whole. For instance, the ultimate good of redemption through Christ's sacrifice is understood as responding to the evil of human sin, making an even greater good possible. However, this argument also faced challenges. Could any amount of suffering be justified by an unknown, greater good? For the suffering individual, this explanation offered little comfort. And how could a truly good God design a world where such horrific suffering was a necessary part of the plan? Critics wondered if this made God seem less benevolent or even manipulative. Natural evil, earthquakes, plagues, famines presented a different kind of problem. These were not the result of human choices. Some medieval thinkers attributed them to the disorder introduced into creation by original sin. Others, following ideas from ancient Greek thought, suggested that the natural world, being material, was inherently imperfect and subject to change and decay. Still others, like Aquinas, maintained that natural evils were simply part of the natural order of a diverse universe. A lion killing a deer, while evil, from the deer's perspective, is natural and necessary for the lion's survival and the balance of the ecosystem. What appears as evil from a limited human viewpoint might be part of the natural good of the cosmos. Despite these various attempts at explanation, the problem of evil remained deeply troubling. No single answer fully satisfied everyone. Philosophers formulated intricate logical arguments, while mystics grappled with the emotional and spiritual pain it caused. The medieval thinkers largely concluded that while they could offer partial explanations, the ultimate reason for the existence of evil in a world created by an all-good God remained a mystery, ultimately rooted in the inscrutable wisdom and power of the divine. They never definitively resolved how an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God could permit the profound suffering and moral corruption that filled their world, leaving the paradox to baffle generations. Number 4. The nature of angels. This might sound like a joke, but the question of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin was actually a serious, if often misquoted, medieval philosophical puzzle. It was never about angels dancing. Instead, it was a shorthand way of discussing profound questions about the nature of non-physical beings, their relationship to space, and the very limits of existence. Medieval scholars did not spend their days counting celestial dancers. They spent them grappling with the true essence of spiritual entities. To understand this, you have to realize that angels were a crucial part of the medieval worldview. They were believed to be pure spiritual beings, created by God, who served as messengers, guardians, and participants in the divine plan. Unlike humans, they had no bodies. This immediately raised a host of perplexing questions. The central puzzle was this: if angels have no bodies, do they occupy space? If they do not occupy space, then how do they interact with the physical world? And if they do not take up space, then any number of them could theoretically be in the same physical location at the same time, including, for example, the tiny point of a pinhead. This was the essence of the angel on a pin question, a thought experiment to explore the implications of a non-material existence. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, dedicated significant sections to the nature of angels. He argued that angels, being purely spiritual, do not occupy space in the same way physical bodies do. A body occupies a certain amount of space by being present in one part of it and excluding other bodies from that part. An angel, however, is present in a place not by filling it up, but by its operation or influence. Think of it like this. A light bulb is physically present in a room and takes up space, but the light it emits is present throughout the room, illuminating it. The light does not fill the space in the way a solid object does. Similarly, an angel is present where it acts or exerts its power. If an angel is communicating with a person, it is present in that person's mind or immediate vicinity by virtue of its activity, not by physically occupying a volume of space. This led to some astonishing conclusions for medieval thinkers. If angels are not limited by physical dimensions, then indeed one angel could be present in a specific location, or many angels could be present in the same location, because their presence is not about occupying volume. An angel is present whole in every part of the place where it operates. If an angel is said to be in a room, it is not like a person who is in one corner and not another. The angel's entire being is present throughout the entire room, as its influence extends throughout. This also meant that angels could not be next to each other in the way that two physical objects can be. Their distinctness came from their individual spiritual essence, not from occupying different spatial coordinates. Two angels might be said to be in the same location, but they would remain distinct by their spiritual difference. The practical implications of these debates were not about counting spirits on a needle. They were about understanding the nature of God's creation, the hierarchy of being, and the interaction between the spiritual and material realms. If angels as God's pure intelligences operated outside the laws of physical space, what did that say about the divine mind itself? It reinforced the idea that God's presence and action were not bound by physical limitations. Duns Scotus, ever the subtle doctor, also weighed in on angelology, although he had slightly different nuances from Aquinas. While largely agreeing that angels do not occupy space like bodies, Scotus suggested that an angel's presence in a place was more about its circumscriptive presence, meaning it was present in a specific determined way, but not necessarily by taking up volume. These subtle differences led to fascinating debates among scholars who carefully dissected every aspect of angelic existence. Other questions about angels also emerged. Do angels have individual thoughts, or do they share a collective mind? How do they communicate with each other? Do they learn, or are they created with full knowledge? Can they move from place to place? And if so, how do purely spiritual beings move without bodies? Medieval philosophers concluded that angels move instantaneously, not by passing through intermediate space, but by willing themselves to be in a new location. Their movement is not a journey, but a change of place, an immediate relocalization of their being. These seemingly obscure debates about angels were deeply serious. They were exercises in rigorous logic, attempting to understand the implications of a non-material existence. By exploring the nature of angels, medieval thinkers pushed the boundaries of their understanding of substance, quantity, motion, and even the very definition of place. They were trying to define what it meant to exist beyond the physical world they inhabited. The angel on a pin question became a shorthand for this entire complex body of thought. How do you logically describe the presence and interaction of beings that defy our everyday understanding of physical reality without making them physical or making them nothing at all? The answer, as always, remained multifaceted and ultimately baffling to the finite human mind. Number 5. Divine foreknowledge and free will. This question is a classic mind-bender that tormented medieval theologians and philosophers. If God knows everything that will happen, including all our future choices, does that mean we are truly free to choose our actions? Or are our choice predetermined by divine knowledge, making our freedom an illusion? This is the problem of divine foreknowledge and free will. and it cuts straight to the heart of human responsibility and the nature of God. For medieval Christian thinkers, two truths were absolutely foundational. God is omniscient. God knows everything. This means God knows the past, the present, and the future all at once. There is nothing hidden from God's knowledge. Humans have free will. Humans are morally responsible for their actions. They can choose good or evil, and their salvation or damnation depends on these choices. If they are not truly free, then concepts like sin, virtue, reward, and punishment seem meaningless. The problem arises when these two truths clash. If God knows that I will choose to eat an apple tomorrow, then is my choice to eat the apple truly free? It seems that if God infallibly knows I will do it, then I must do it. If I must do it, then I cannot choose not to do it. And if I cannot choose not to do it, then I am not really free. This line of reasoning troubled many. One of the most influential early treatments of this problem came from Boethius. Writing in the 6th century, in his Consolation of Philosophy, he addressed the question head-on. Boethius argued that the confusion comes from thinking of God's knowledge in the same way we think of human knowledge. Humans experience time singly, past, present, future. God, however, exists outside of time. For God, there is no past, present, or future in the human sense. All of time is eternally present to God. Boethius used an analogy. Imagine you are standing on a very high mountain and watching a procession pass below you. You can see the people at the front, the middle, and the back of the procession all at once. You see them doing various things, walking, talking, waving. Your seeing them do these things does not cause them to do those things. They are doing them freely, and you are simply observing it all simultaneously. Similarly, God's knowledge is like this eternal, simultaneous gaze. God sees all of time, including all of our future choices, not as a prediction of something that will happen, but as an eternal, present reality. Therefore, for Boethius, God's foreknowledge does not cause our actions. It simply sees them. Our free choices are still free, even though God knows them. God's knowledge is not a causal force. It is an infallible perception. This distinction became incredibly important for later medieval thinkers. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, built upon Boethius's ideas in his Summa Theologica. Aquinas also emphasized that God's knowledge is eternal and perfect. He explained that God does not merely know things as they exist in themselves, but also knows their mode of existence. So, God knows that a free choice is a free choice. God knows that we will choose freely, and His knowledge does not diminish that freedom. The necessity comes from the infallibility of God's knowledge, not from a predetermined causal chain. If God knows X will happen, then X must happen. The 10th happens because we freely choose it, and God knows that free choice. The necessity is logical, not causal. Another facet of the medieval discussion explored God's will versus God's knowledge. Could God know something without willing it? And if God wills something, is it then necessary? John Duns Scotus, the subtle doctor, explored the absolute freedom of God's will. Scotus, in his Ordinatio, stressed that God's will is utterly free and primary. God wills things to be, and they are. This raised questions about whether God's will could be arbitrary, but Scotus argued that God's will is always perfectly good and rational, even if its reasons are beyond human comprehension. While God's knowledge is perfect, it is secondary to His will. God knows what He wills to be and what His creatures will freely choose. The debate also touched upon the concept of contingency. Contingent event is one that could either happen or not happen. Its outcome is not necessary. If God knows all contingent events, are they truly contingent? Medieval thinkers generally affirmed that events remain contingent even if God knows them, precisely because God's knowledge embraces their contingent nature. It's like knowing that a coin flip will result in heads, but the coin flip itself is still a genuinely random, contingent event. Despite these sophisticated arguments, the problem remained baffling because of its inherent tension. It is hard for the human mind, bound by linear time and cause and effect thinking, to fully grasp a concept of knowledge that does not imply causation, or a freedom that is fully known beforehand without being compelled. Many thinkers concluded that while they could articulate distinctions, the ultimate harmony between divine omniscient foreknowledge and genuine human free will was a profound mystery, something to be accepted by faith, even if not fully comprehended by reason. Continued to be a source of intellectual fascination and sometimes frustration as thinkers strove to reconcile the infinite perfection of God with the moral reality of human existence. Number 6. The soul and the body. What is a human being? This question, fundamental to understanding existence, was a constant source of profound philosophical debate in the medieval period. At its core lay the soul and body problem. How do the non-physical immortal soul and the physical mortal body relate to each other? How do they interact, and what happens to the soul after the body dies? This was not just an academic exercise. It had deep implications for understanding life, death, morality, and salvation. For medieval Christian thinkers, the existence of an immortal soul was a given, based on biblical teachings and theological tradition. The soul was understood as the animating principle of life, the seat of reason, will, and emotion, and the part of a human being that continued to exist after death. The body, on the other hand, was material, perishable, and subject to decay. The challenge was to explain how these two vastly different entities could form a single human being. Early Christian thinkers, influenced by Platonic philosophy, often viewed the soul as almost imprisoned within the body. Plato believed the soul was distinct and superior to the body, and true knowledge involved escaping the distractions of the material world to contemplate eternal forms. Augustine of Hippo, while rejecting some aspects of Platonic dualism, still maintained a clear distinction between soul and body. He described the soul as a spiritual substance that uses the body, viewing the body as a kind of tool or instrument for the soul. The soul was rational and incorporeal, while the body was irrational and corporeal. This view, while making sense of the soul's immortality, struggled to explain how they could truly form one unified person rather than just two separate entities temporarily linked. How could a non-physical soul genuinely move a physical arm, or a physical pain affect a non-physical mind? Introduction of Aristotle's works into the Latin West in the 12th and 13th centuries revolutionized this debate. Aristotle had a very different view of the soul. For him, the soul was not a separate entity temporarily residing in the body, but rather the form of the body. Think of a statue. The clay is the matter, but the shape of the statue is its form. The form gives the matter its specific nature and function. For Aristotle, the soul was the form of the living body, giving it life, sensation, and thought. It was the principle by which a body is a living, functioning organism. Thomas Aquinas, deeply influenced by Aristotle, developed the most sophisticated and widely accepted medieval theory of the soul and body in his Summa Theologica. Aquinas argued for a concept called hylomorphism, which states that a human being is a single unified substance composed of two co-principles: matter, the body, and form, the soul. The soul is not just a pilot guiding a ship, the body, but the very actuality of the body. It gives the body its specific nature as a human body, enabling it to perform its functions of life, sensation, and intellect. The soul is truly the form of the body. This view elegantly addressed the unity of the human being. A human is not a soul plus a body, but a composite of both, making a single, integrated substance. The soul and body are intimately connected, each incomplete without the other in this life. The soul actualizes the body, and the body provides the medium for the soul's operations, especially sensing and imagining, which are necessary for intellectual understanding when you think your soul is involved. When you see, your eyes, part of your body, are involved, but your soul processes the visual information. Pain in the body affects the soul, and emotions in the soul affect the body. However, even Aquinas' brilliant synthesis presented new difficulties. If the soul is the form of the body, and forms depend on matter for their existence, how could the soul be immortal and survive the death of the body? If the body is destroyed, does the form not also cease to exist? Aquinas tackled this by arguing that the human soul, unlike the souls of animals or plants, possessed an intellect that could understand universal concepts and reflect on itself. This capacity for intellectual activity, he argued, was independent of any specific bodily organ and therefore indicated that the rational soul was a subsistent, though incomplete substance. It could exist without the body even if its natural state was to be united with a body. So, while the soul is the form of the body, it is a special kind of form, capable of existing separately. This was a crucial point, allowing for both the unity of soul and body in life and the immortality of the soul after death, awaiting reunion with a resurrected body. Other thinkers, like Duns Scotus, offer different perspectives. Scotus, while acknowledging the soul as the body's form, emphasized the soul's independence more strongly than Aquinas. He argued that the soul had its own distinct existence and powers that were not dependent on the body. This slightly shifted the emphasis back towards a more Platonic understanding of the soul's distinctness, even while still integrating Aristotelian ideas. The debates about the soul and body were incredibly intricate, involving discussions about the soul's faculties, intellect, will, memory, how ideas are formed. Do they come from sensory experience, or are they innate? And the precise moment of ensoulment, when the soul enters the body, a question with major impetus for moral theology. They debated how the soul, being simple, without parts, could perform such diverse operations, or how it could be corrupted by sin. The soul and body problem remained a baffling mystery throughout the medieval period, because it touched upon the very limits of human understanding about existence. How could something entirely spiritual interact with something entirely physical? How could they be one without losing their distinct natures? Medieval philosophers offered sophisticated theories and detailed arguments, but the ultimate mechanics of this intimate union and the precise nature of the soul's continued existence after death remained fundamentally mysterious, a testament to the profound complexities of human nature itself. Number 7. The prime mover. From the smallest pebble tumbling down a hill to the vast celestial spheres rotating in the night sky, everything in the medieval universe seemed to be in motion or undergoing change. For medieval philosophers steeped in both ancient Greek thought and Christian theology, this constant motion begged a profound question. What caused it all? If everything that moves is moved by something else, then what was the very first cause of all motion, the ultimate origin of all change? This was the question of the prime mover, and it was a deeply baffling puzzle, because it required finding a cause that itself had no prior cause. The concept of a prime mover has its roots in ancient Greek philosophy, particularly in the work of Aristotle. In his Physics and Metaphysics, Aristotle observed that every instance of motion or change implies a mover. A ball moves because it is kicked. A tree grows because of internal forces and external nutrients. He reasoned that this chain of movers could not go on infinitely. There must be a first unmoved mover that initiates all motion without itself being moved by anything else. This unmoved mover for Aristotle was pure actuality, eternal and perfect. It caused motion not by physical contact, but by being the object of desire or aspiration, like a beloved object causes love without itself moving. The celestial spheres, seeing the perfection of the unmoved mover, rotated eternally in imitation of its perfect state, and this motion was then transmitted down to the earthly realm. When Aristotle's works were rediscovered and translated into Latin in the medieval period, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, Christian thinkers immediately recognized the profound implications for their theology. They sought to reconcile Aristotle's philosophical concept of the unmoved mover with the Christian God. Could Aristotle's prime mover be the Christian God? Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, famously incorporated Aristotle's ideas into his 5 ways, arguments for the existence of God. In his Summa Theologica, the very first of these ways is the argument from motion. Aquinas argued that everything in the world is in motion or undergoing change. Whatever is moved by another. This chain of movers cannot extend to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and thus no subsequent motion. Therefore, there must be a first mover unmoved by anything else, and this all men understand to be God. This argument was incredibly influential, but it also opened up deeper questions. What exactly was the nature of this unmoved motion? If God is completely outside of the physical world, how does God cause motion within it without himself being affected by it? If God is pure actuality and does not change, how can he be the ultimate cause of all change and motion in the universe? Philosophers grappled with the nature of causality itself. Was the prime mover a direct, efficient cause, constantly pushing things into motion? Or was it a final cause, a goal or ultimate purpose, towards which all things strive, thereby initiating their movement? Aristotle leaned towards the latter, suggesting a kind of attraction rather than a push. Medieval theologians generally combined both ideas. God is the efficient cause. He created the world and set it in motion, and the final cause. All things strive towards him as their ultimate end. Another perplexing aspect was the relationship between the prime mover and time. If the prime mover is eternal and outside of time, how does it initiate a temporal process like motion? This tied into the problem of divine foreknowledge and free will. If God is the ultimate cause, does that mean everything is predetermined? Medieval thinkers usually distinguished between God's primary causality, initiating all existence and sustaining it, and the secondary causality of created things, which have their own powers and, in humans, free will. God, as the prime mover, was seen as the sustainer of all motion, constantly upholding the natural laws and powers he instilled in creation. The concept of the prime mover also raised questions about the beginning of the universe. Did the universe have a beginning in time, as Christian theology asserts, through creation ex nihilo, out of nothing? Or was it eternal, as Aristotle believed, based on his logic? Aquinas, famously, argued that while reason could demonstrate that God is the prime mover, reason alone could not definitively prove whether the universe had a beginning in time or was eternal. This required faith. This distinction between what reason could demonstrate and what faith revealed was a careful balancing act for medieval thinkers. The problem of the prime mover was baffling precisely because it required thinking about causality in a way that defied everyday experience. Everything we see is caused by something else, but to postulate an uncaused cause, a mover that is unmoved, pushed the limits of human reason. How could something be the source of all motion and change without itself changing? How could it be active without undergoing any process? The medieval thinkers, while confidently asserting the necessity of such a first mover, acknowledged that its ultimate nature and the precise mechanics of its causality remained a profound mystery, pointing towards a transcendent reality, beyond full human grasp. Number 8. The existence of God. For most medieval thinkers, the existence of God was not a question to be answered. It was a foundational truth, the very bedrock of their reality. Yet even with this absolute certainty, they engaged in intense philosophical debates about how God's existence could be demonstrated through reason alone, independent of faith. Could human logic, without relying on sacred scripture or divine revelation, prove the existence of an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing creator? This was the baffling challenge. To prove what they already believed, using only the tools of rational inquiry. Two main approaches dominated these discussions, each with its own set of strengths and profound difficulties. The first approach was the ontological argument, most famously articulated by Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century in his work Proslogion. Anselm's argument was truly audacious and baffling in its simplicity. He started with the very concept of God. He defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He reasoned that if such a being existed only in the understanding, in someone's mind, then it would be possible to conceive of an even greater being, one that exists not only in the understanding but also in reality. But if you could conceive of a greater being than that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, then your initial definition of God would be flawed. Therefore, Anselm concluded, God must exist not only in the understanding but also in reality. His existence is a necessary part of his perfection. To deny God's existence for Anselm was to fall into a logical contradiction. This argument was a brilliant piece of pure reasoning, derived from the very definition of God. However, it immediately encountered fierce opposition. Gaunilo of Marmoutiers, a contemporary of Anselm, famously challenged it with a counterexample, known as Gaunilo's Lost Island. He argued that by Anselm's logic one could prove the existence of a most perfect island, an island than which no greater island can be conceived. If such an island existed only in the mind, one could conceive of a greater island, one that also exists in reality. Therefore, the most perfect island must exist in reality. But this is clearly absurd, Gaunilo argued. Simply defining something as most perfect does not make it real. Anselm defended his argument by saying that the most perfect island was a contingent being. It could exist or not exist, while God by definition is a necessary being whose non-existence is inconceivable. Despite Anselm's defense, the ontological argument remained highly controversial. It was logically elegant, but felt like a trick of language to many. It seemed to conjure existence out of a mere definition, rather than proving it from observation of the world. It remained baffling because it asked reason to accept a conclusion that seemed to defy the usual way we establish facts about the world. The second major approach involved cosmological arguments, which sought to prove God's existence by observing the world around us. These arguments moved from the existence of the universe and its features to the necessity of a first cause. The most famous medieval proponent of these arguments was Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century in his 5 Ways from Summa Theologica. We have already touched on the argument from motion, the prime mover. Aquinas also offered the argument from efficient causality. Everything has an efficient cause. Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. An infinite chain of efficient causes is impossible. Therefore, there must be a first efficient cause, which is God. If you trace all causes and effects backward, you cannot go on forever. There must be an uncaused first cause. Argument from contingency. Everything in the world is contingent. It could either exist or not exist. If everything were contingent, then at some point, nothing might have existed, and thus nothing would exist now. But things do exist. Therefore, there must be a necessary being whose existence is not contingent, and this is God. The argument from degrees of perfection. We observe varying degrees of goodness, truth, nobility, and other perfections in the world, but more or less implies a standard, a maximum. There must therefore be something that is the cause of all perfections in others, and this most perfect being is God. The argument from design, teleological argument, we observe that natural bodies which lack intelligence act for an end or purpose. For example, a tree grows leaves to photosynthesize. This orderly behavior, directed towards an end, implies an intelligent designer or governor. Therefore, there must be an intelligent being that directs all natural things to their ends, and this is God. These cosmological arguments were generally more accepted than the ontological argument because they started from observable facts about the world. However, they also faced their own baffling questions. Did an infinite regress of causes truly lead to a logical impossibility? Could the universe itself be necessary and uncaused? Did degrees of perfection necessarily point to a singular ultimate perfect being, or simply to a scale of comparison? Could apparent design in nature be explained by natural processes without needing a divine intelligence? Critics at the time, and certainly later, questioned the logical leaps involved in moving from observations of the finite world to the existence of an infinite transcendent God. Medieval philosophers pored over these arguments, dissecting every premise and conclusion. They did not question God's existence, but they passionately debated whether human reason, left to its own devices, was truly capable of demonstrating it with undeniable certainty. The answers they proposed were intricate, elegant, and often ingenious, reflecting a profound commitment to both faith and reason. Yet, the persistent questions about the logical validity of each argument and the different ways they approached the ultimate mystery of existence meant that the proof of God's existence, while deeply satisfying to some, remained a source of intellectual fascination and subtle philosophical perplexity, a testament to the enduring, baffling questions of the medieval mind.